Dennis Andrew Nilsen is a British serial killer and necrophile. He is considered one of the most terrible maniacs in the history of Great Britain, whose crimes caused a great public outcry. He was born on November 23, 1945 in Scotland. Unlike many serial killers, Dennis was not aggressive in childhood, did not experience bouts of sudden uncontrollable rage and did not show a tendency to cruelty to animals. On the contrary, other people's aggressiveness somewhat frightened him. In 1961, Dennis Nilsan enlisted in the British Armed Forces, where he became an army cook. In this position, he mastered the skills and abilities of a butcher. On December 30, 1978, he went out into the street with a desperate desire to meet at least someone. As a result, he brings home a young man with whom they drink beer all evening. Waking up at night, Nilsen, by his own words, was afraid that the young man would leave him, as all his previous lovers had done. First, he strangles the young stranger with a tie, then lowers his head into a bucket of water. Recently, thanks to a team of detectives who decided to solve all hopeless cases, the identity of the first victim was established. It was Stephen Dinholmes. He was 14 years old. A year later, Nilsen tries to kill Andrew Ho, a young man he met in a gay bar, but he resists him and runs away. On December 3, 1979, Nilsen commits a second murder, his victim being 23-year-old Canadian student Kenneth Ockenden. Nilsen strangles him with a headphone cord, after which he begins to play with the corpse. He undresses him, washes him, dresses him, photographs him in different poses, paints his face with makeup and even drinks tea and watches TV with him. In the future, all the men he killed would suffer the same fate. Dennis Nilsen's victims were usually homeless teenagers and young men from dysfunctional families, whom he lured to his home. The parents were not concerned about the fate of the runaway children, so no one reported them missing. On May 13, 1980, Nilsen killed his third victim, 16-year-old homeless alcoholic and drug addict Martin Duffy. Nilsen again took a bath with the corpse. Nilsen would later explain his passion for washing corpses as follows: a victim is the dirty dishes left over from a feast, and washing them is a normal hygienic procedure. Perhaps by feast he meant a feast of life. Duffy's body was in the cupboard for 2 weeks before Nilsen placed it under the floor next to Kenneth Ockenden's body. Midsummer 1980. The smell of decomposition in Nilsen's house becomes unbearable, so he decides to get rid of the corpses under the floor. He dismembers them, places the heads in plastic garbage bags and the torsos in 2 suitcases, and hides it all in a shed in the garden. He buries some of the limbs in the garden, and throws the entrails in plastic bags into garbage bins. Sometime later, a passerby finds a piece of an internal organ in a bin, the appearance of which seemed suspicious to him. He took it to the police, but they told him it was just scraps from a butcher's shop. Between July and September 1980, Nilsen's fourth victim was 26-year-old Scotsman Billy Sutherland. Nilsen did not remember killing him. The only thing he remembered was waking up next to his dead body in the morning. On August 11, 1980, the police visited Nilsen at the request of Douglas Stewart. Stewart complained that he had fallen asleep in a chair in Nilsen's house, and when he woke up, his legs were tied, and Nilsen had wrapped a tie around his neck. Stewart began to resist, pushed Nilsen away, and Nilsen told him to leave. The police only drew up a report. On November 10, 1980, one of Nilsen's potential victims woke up while he was trying to strangle her. The young man broke free and ran away. He reported this to the police, but again they did nothing, considering it to be the usual sadomasochistic games of 2 homosexuals. Nilsen told the court that he had only 7 such potential victims, and that he allowed them to escape only because he could overcome himself and come out of this state, resembling a trance, in which he committed the murders. Perhaps Nilsen said this because he wanted to be declared insane. By the end of 1980, Nilsen had already killed a total of 10 people. The 5th victim was a young man of Filipino or Latin American descent. The 6th victim was an Irish builder. The 7th victim was a homeless hippie suffering from malnutrition. Nilsen invited him to his place, fed him and drank a bottle of rum with him. When the young man fell asleep, he strangled him with a tie. However, he was so emaciated that Nilsen simply could not look at his body. He looked like he had escaped from a concentration camp, and quickly got rid of him. Nilsen could not remember anything about the 8th victim. The 9th and 10th victims were 18 years old. Nilsen met them in the Golden Lion Bar on Dean Street. Early 1981, Nilsen kills the 11th victim. It was a skinhead he had met found himself in Piccadilly Circus, or, according to other sources, in Leicester Square. On his neck was a tattoo of a dotted line and the inscription, "Cut along the dotted line." Nilsen did this when he dismembered his body. Nilsen aired out his house twice a day to get rid of the smell of decomposition and flies. Neighbors began to complain, but Nilsen told them that this was the normal smell of the building. To dispose of the bodies, Nilsen locked his pets in the garden, stripped down to his underpants, placed the body on the stone floor of the kitchen, cut up the body with knives, and boiled some of the body parts in a cauldron bought when he committed his first murder. He placed the body parts in plastic bags, took them to the garden and burned them on a fire there. He put old car tires in the fire so that the smell of burning rubber would mask the smell of burning flesh. He crushed the large unburned bones with a lawn mower and smashed them with a hammer, and scattered the ashes in the garden. On September 18, 1981, Nilsen killed his 12th victim, a mentally retarded 24-year-old Malcolm Barlow, who suffered from epilepsy. Barlow had a seizure in the street, right outside Nilsen's front door. Nilsen had called an ambulance for him, and the next day Barlow decided to stop by to thank his savior. He sat on the steps of the house and waited for several hours until Nilsen came home from work. Nilsen invited him in, and Barlow immediately asked for a drink. Nilsen warned him that epilepsy medications do not mix well with alcohol, but Barlow decided to take a chance. After drinking several glasses of rum, he fell asleep, or lost consciousness. Nilsen strangled him. On October 5, 1981, Nilsen moved into an attic room in a block of flats in North London, in Muswell Hill, Cranley Gardens. The landlord allegedly wanted to renovate the house and paid Nilsen the rather hefty sum of £1,000 to move out. Although the landlord may have done this because he had tenants who were willing to pay much more than Nilsen. In addition, Nilsen was a problem tenant, paying irregularly, and the neighbors complained about him because of the same stench. On November 23, 1981, Nilsen brought home a 19-year-old student, Paul Nobbs. They had a drink, then went to bed. Nobbs woke up at 2:30 with a terrible headache. He fell asleep again and woke up at 6 a.m. In the kitchen mirror he saw a deep red mark on his neck, the whites of his eyes were red and his face was blue. Nilsen said Nobbs looked terrible and advised him to see a doctor. He went to see a doctor that day, who told him that the marks on his neck could only have been caused by someone trying to strangle him. Nobbs did not report the incident to the police. In December 1981, Nilsen killed his 13th victim, 23-year-old John Howlett, whom he had met earlier in a pub. A few days later, while Nilsen was drinking alone, he was approached by Howlett, who recognized him. They began to talk and then went to Nilsen's new flat. After a while, Howlett began to irritate Nilsen with his impudent behavior because he felt too much at home. Nilsen sarcastically remarked, "I didn't know you had moved here. I think it's time for you to move out. You'd better leave now." But he didn't want to leave and eventually got drunk almost to the point of coma, and in this state Nilsen strangled him with his bare hands, and then, according to his usual scenario, drowned him in the bathtub. According to other sources, Howlett was not that drunk, and when Nilsen tried to strangle him, not with his hands, but with a piece of upholstery fabric, he began to resist and even tried to strangle Nilsen himself. Later, he dismembered the body, boiled the head, threw the large bones in the trash, and placed the internal organs, arms and legs in plastic bags, into which he poured salt, and hid them in a tea box. He flushed some of the organs and pieces of flesh down the toilet. December 24, 1981, another potential victim of Nilsen, Toshimitsu Osawa, whom he tried to strangle. 1982, the 14th victim was a 28-year-old homeless alcoholic and drug addict named Graham Allen, whom Nilsen met on Shaftesbury Avenue. However, he had no memory of killing him. The body lay in the bath for 2 days, then underwent the same processing as the previous victim. To eliminate the smell of decomposition, which had already begun to bother the neighbors, Nilsen sprayed disinfectant in huge quantities of air freshener around the apartment several times a day. April 1982. Nilsen tried to kill a 21-year-old transvestite named Carl Stoddard. Stoddard woke up unable to breathe. He saw Nilsen above him and thought he was trying to help him. Nilsen dragged Stoddard into the bathroom and submerged him in a bath filled with water. Stoddard begged him to stop, but he did not. When Stoddard stopped struggling, Nilsen thought he was dead and carried him back to the room. Nilsen's dog Blip jumped on Stoddard and began licking his face. Nilsen discovered that Stoddard were alive and put him to bed. When he came to, Nilsen told him that his throat was pinched by the zipper of his sleeping bag. Stoddard thought he had dreamed it all. Although he went to the hospital, where he was told that someone had tried to strangle him, he did not report it to the police. On February 1, 1983, Nilsen killed his 15th and final victim, 20-year-old homeless drug addict Stephen Sinclair, who had hepatitis. Nilsen was walking down Oxford Street eating a hamburger when Sinclair accosted him and began begging for food. Nilsen then suggested that they go to his place. At Nilsen's home, Sinclair drank beer and whiskey, took heroin and fell asleep, at which point Nilsen strangled him. When he removed Sinclair's shirt from his body, he saw that the victim's hand was bandaged. After removing the bandage and seeing the cuts underneath, Nilsen realized that Sinclair had recently tried to slit his wrists. Nilsen was arrested after concerned neighbors called a plumber to clear a blockage in the drain. The blockage was caused by huge chunks of rotting meat. The plumber reported it to the police. After learning about this, Nilsen secretly snuck into the manhole at night and removed the remains, but this foray was noticed by a neighbor. The next day, Nilsen was arrested. The court sentenced Nilsen to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. In 2006, after a retrial, Nilsen was told that he would never be released early. Nilsen died in prison on May 12, 2018, from a blood clot in his lung, at the age of 72, after 35 years in prison.